Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for SGB's exhibition season Psyche. For those of you who are new here, Science Gallery Bengaluru is a public institution for research-based engagement, and Psyche is our 5th exhibition season, and it explores the complexities of the human mind. Today, I'm pleased to have you all here as a part of an event with Andrew Carnie and Marius Quinn called Change My Mind. Before I introduce you to Andrew and Marius, I'd just like to briefly tell you about some of the other programs happening this weekend, as this is the second last weekend of programming at Psyche. After this event, we have a film discussion about the film Claire X Bosco with filmmaker Mutiganda Nukunda and lawyer Alice Bullard and global health researcher Injonge Karangwa. This is at 4:30. Then we also have a lecture later in the evening on livable life, state and corporate bias in the making of suicide by social scientist China Mills. So this is at 6:30 p.m. in the evening. Now, without further ado, I'll start off by introducing Andrew and Marius. Andrew Carnie is an artist and academic. He is currently part of the teaching team of fine arts at Winchester School of Art at the University of Southampton in England. He studied chemistry and painting at Warren Wilson College, North Carolina, then zoology and psychology at Durham University, before finishing a degree in fine art at Goldsmiths College, London. Andrew then completed his master's degree in the painting school at the Royal College of Art. He has continued as a practicing artist ever since. In 2003, he was the Picker Fellow at Kingston University. His practice often involves a meaningful exchange with scientists. Themes and ideas are often based around neurology, the brain, and how we get a sense of ourselves through ideas and images generated by contemporary science. Andrew, of course, is one of the artists we're presenting at Psyche. And I'd now like to introduce our next discussant, Marius Quinn. Marius is also one of the curatorial advisors on Psyche. Marius's doctorate at Magdalen College at the University of Oxford was on the history of the circus in 18th and 19th century England. His subsequent roles included research fellowships at the Victoria and Albert Museum and Royal College of Art, and the Houghton Library, Harvard University, and then a decade as a lecturer at the History of Art at the University of Oxford. Marius currently teaches visual culture to practical art and design students at the University of Portsmouth and on the south coast of England. He has curated several exhibitions, including the absolutely wonderful Brains, the Mind as Matter at the Wellcome Collection in 2012 and the Museum of Science and Industry, Manchester in 2013. And Frontiers Reimagined, Art That Connects Us with Sundaram Tagore at the 2015 Venice Art Biennale. I'd like to let the audience know that the first part of the session would be brief presentations by both Andrew and Marius, and then there will be an interactive session where the participants in the Change My Mind exhibit will be in discussion with Andrew and Marius. So for the second half, please do keep your cameras on so that we can have an interactive session. I'll now hand it over to Andrew.
Hi, I'd just like to say hello to everybody and thank everybody, particularly the Science Museum in Bengaluru has been great to work with. And it's been really nice. I'd also like to thank at the very beginning all of the participants who've participated their work and their effort to the project, really. And then I'd like also just to thank Marius for being here today to discuss the work as we look at it later. I'm going to do a brief introduction to my own work to try to open up some kind of points for discussion. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the history of what I've been doing has been, a little bit then about two projects that are kind of very relevant to what I've done for this project, and then a little bit about actually how it's worked out in process. So I'm just going to change now to screen sharing, and I will go through a PowerPoint for a little while. Let's hope all this technology works. Right, so we're starting a little bit. So To begin, as I said, I'm just going to talk a little bit about prior work and the brain and the creativity and kind of area that I've been kind of operating in for a while. And I need to mention a few things in a way. Obviously, I came to kind of science and art quite late in a career, having though studied science at university at Durham. But couple of the principal things that I've always followed is a kind of sense of simplicity in work and making work with the objects that I'm kind of working with. So I've done whole periods of work, kind of working with sculpture and painting. But these two works, this work here and this work, kind of belies a lot of my early work, in a sense of kind of keeping it simple, keeping it very much within the materials of usually what I'm working with. So these were both made out of just suitcases, and this, in a sense, kind of laser cut. And some of these things kind of are precursors to what's come later. I then want to talk simply really about where I started. And I think in terms of kind of making science artwork, it was really with a piece called Magic Forest that I made for the Science Museum after a visit by Marina Wallace to my studio, who I didn't know was selecting work for this and really was concentrating on the suitcase work. And then she began to see these other kind of images and things that I was doing, knew that I had a little bit of a history of working in science, and thought I would be a real apt person for making work. And I made this work with King's College, London, and with Dr. Richard Wingate. And it became a piece about the changing brain. And I think the format was kind of interesting. It's kind of slightly difficult to see, but this is a projection piece onto a series of voile screens. You can get a sense of the scale and the size of it here. This is the beginning of the work. It's set up like this, and projects back and forth. And I was really kind of interested in what goes on. This is the final sequence of slides. And it kind of lays out, and it's kind of interactive, and it's kind of sculptural. And this was the beginning of a whole series of kind of works that go on that are around projection, which has been the bulk of my work for a very, very long time. These are other kind of sequences. This is from a work called Disperse, which really looked at the manner in which bodies are kind of recirculated to the earth. And you'll see these kinds of themes come through with kind of interests. So this, in a sense, kind of hints at a kind of wider interest of our bodies and being in this world, in a sense. But again, it was projected like this in this format. This is just kind of a kind of images. But I must say that there was also other work that I did outside the kind of science area. And this is one of those works, 451, which was simply about the removal and the change of objects. Everything disappears, everything burns, everything goes. And as I moved on, I kind of think that the core to the work was really kind of trying to explore the sense of self through science, through contemporary ideas and images of science, but particularly the ideas behind it. So if I reference Magic Forest, it was very much that in exploring the brain and contemporary neurology at that point, one got this sense of change. When I had been 17 or 18, the biology teacher basically said, oh, your brain is a fixed wired system by the time you're 18 or 19. From the work that I undertook, I found, well, this was far from true. Everything is changing, everything is morphing into something else in a way, and there are these changes that go on in the brain. And as I went on, I became more interested in the totality of the body and its kind of, our perspective of it through science in a way. So this became a piece of work around that, which you could be inside and view from outside. I was very interested in kind of how we viewed ourselves and how we viewed ourselves through all of these networks that made up our very complex body. And as time's moved on, the most recent works that I've made, in a sense, have been these large-scale projection pieces that really look at our work and our integration into the environment, really, which obviously in contemporary science is becoming more and more understood. And I think this kind of notion of mycelial connection between trees and the organisms in our world and our relationship to that. And so I was very much kind of echoing what was outside us and what was inside us. These are video projections that look at that kind of area and explore it. I made two works recently, the one you've just seen previously, and then this one here. Again, large scale, often involving a lot of preparation in terms of making the work. Often these pieces take 6 months to make. I start with images and then I'm kind of animating them, and they're like films, but they're like slow animation that come about. So this is the kind of background to my work for a long time. And then through another project, I began to kind of slightly make more physical things. And again, what you see here is things that are laser cut, which again preempts some of the things that I've done with Change My Mind project. This is a project around heart transplants, and unbeknownst, this again comes from that project, but you can see the physicality really kind of in the work, the things that are kind of coming out. This, in a sense, was around the heart transplant project, where, in a way, one of the things that was very interesting is how the donor families are often, families from donors of heart transplant often want to know a lot more about where the heart has gone and the recipient. And it's a kind of really interesting, strange chase in a way for them that never leaves them. They're always wondering about where the heart has gone. This is another kind of work that again shows this kind of move to a kind of physical form of work. This is again a piece that's laser cut. It's a series of, in this case, 3 concertina books that are all laser cut into a kind of forest that sits on the ground. And I kind of, when you laser cut, it often gives out this very burnt kind of smell. And I kind of quite like this in relation to the forest. And I originally conceived it when there were a lot of forest fires in Portugal one summer, and this tentativeness about the environment, and also the kind of notion that I was making it out of books, which came from paper, which, you know, come from trees. So this was the kind of background to it. So I just want to now talk about two works that I kind of think are very relevant, and I've mentioned the Heart Project. Oh, sorry, that's the second one I'm going to come to. I'm going to come to the one where I realized that actually what I was doing was very much kind of looking at implants into the body. And this is work that I did for the Can Do project, and it was controlling abnormal network dynamics using optogenetics. And I've tried to very briefly explain kind of what that is. It's slightly difficult and a complex process. But I just wanted to talk about that kind of notion of implants, because we're, in Change My Mind, we're talking about them in the brain, but it has a long kind of history, whether it was the Etruscans kind of decorating their teeth, or actually other societies using bits of shell as implants to help with their eating and chewing, and that. So it goes back thousands of years, this kind of notion of putting things into the body. In terms of, oh, sorry, just pressing the slides too far. Oh, going a bit crazy there. In terms of the optogenetics, it's about using 2 processes. It's about putting a device into the brain, but also doing some genetic engineering and changing the nature of cells, in a sense, to accept a signal that will trigger them, make them fire using blue light. So there's a little device put into the brain that will fire and make a blue light. This blue light will affect a cell, turn it on, basically. So it involves 2 aspects of changing the body and transforming it. This is a project that's sort of fizzling out at the minute. It's had funding for a long time and has had some results, very positive results, and you can see some of these on the internet. But basically, it was just trying to control epilepsy. So basically, when you have an epileptic attack, the brain waves change. This little device in the brain detects those changes, fires a little blue light, which fires a whole set of cells surrounding that epileptic center and sublimates them, diminishes their activity. So very interesting things. But the whole part of my interest in the project, in a sense, came when I realized some of the legal implications for adding something to the brain. And this came about when, in discussions with the scientists, they suddenly turned around and said, oh, actually, well, if we get the chance to put this into a human being, after a year, we're just going to take it out. And I said, what, even if it's successful? And they said, yes. And this came about very much about legal concerns they had about the overall effect of having this device in the brain, what would happen to it, whether some of the chemicals inside it would leach out. One of the very big problems about putting things into any part of the body is the boundaries, encapsulating it so that the body doesn't attack it. The body very much wants to integrate, separate things that go into our bodies, whether it be into the brain, into the head, any part of our body. This is kind of very interesting. So started talking to some legal people who began to say, well, you know, the legal aspect of all of this is very outdated in a way, because we have very distinct ways of categorizing what's what and who, you know, how these elements lie, you know, whether it's human or it's nature, it's a man or a woman, it's an individual or a group. They're very tied up with these, and how the law works doesn't lend for these blended situations, somebody being kind of hybrid in a way. So there was always this sense that the body encapsulates, incorporates whatever devices we take in. In the heart project, one of the things that happens is if you put somebody else's heart in, there's a sense in which the DNA, well, we're told by scientists often that the DNA does not spread, but there's increasing evidence that the DNA from a heart or whatever organ is put in does pervade other cells around it. So there's always this case of boundaries being broken. And very interestingly, I think as patients, when we receive devices, we always think that we own them. And in a sense, I think there's an element that the companies that produce these devices want us to own them, so that they're not legally liable. But obviously they are legally liable. And I think some of you might possibly know about the whole controversy over breast implants that were done by a French company in Europe who used not very high-grade silicon, and then ran into lots and lots of problems, and are being sued massively now for something that they did, you know, in a very bad way, in a sense. So there's this. The legal part became really interesting about these controls, and I think with a lot of the devices that are going in, there's an element of there may not just being a device in the body, that they are feeding information or being controlled from outside. And I think this is a kind of really interesting thing. And I think what happened with Dick Cheney in 2013, when he had a pacemaker put in, which was sending information back to his doctors. When the CIA became aware of this, they were very concerned that outside terrorists could interfere with that device. So the wireless part was deactivated. So there's this whole sense of like, where do we lie? And we're not in a sense necessarily bounded at the skin if we have a device put in us, and how that plays out. As a result, I've made a whole, so I'm just kind of thinking, yeah, so lots of controversy over it about copyright as well. Who owns the device? Who owns the copyright? What if some company puts something into you and the copyright is owned by a third party, and they haven't given the copyright to the people that put the device in? Who owns it? Can they stop it? All sorts of issues begin to arise when we have implants or something is trying to change our mind. I made a sequences of works that try to reflect some of these elements that were shown in the Hatton Gallery, large-scale projection works, some more physical works, where I was trying to, in a sense, in this part of the show, look at that complexity, look at how difficult it was in part to take ownership of these objects, and especially in this piece, A Tale of Two, where I had texts in it that tried to discuss some of the elements of the legal situation of the ownership and some of the questions we might ask about it, and particularly about whether we wanted to have devices in us that aided performance, or we were just trying to get ourselves and treat ourselves and be back to normal in a way. So these are all things that have come up kind of in the project. as it's developed. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about a second project that happened in parallel, and this came out of a long-scale project that I've been involved in around heart transplant and healing, knowing, seeing the body, a show at the Spencer Museum of Art in Kansas. This show allowed me to kind of explore some other ideas. So the Heart Project had been looking at the psychological state of the people that had received hearts, and then a long section on people that had been in families that one of their relatives had unfortunately died and given over a heart. And it involved looking at, over a long period of time, videos of interviews of those people, and trying to explore psychologically what the damages or what the problems was, because there's a sense in which very much in terms of heart surgeons, it's like Cartesian, you're just fixing something, you're just exchanging something, you're just replacing a pump with another pump. And psychologically, this does not appear to be true at all. So the chance came, I made complex work about changes of the body and about where we lay, what's our center, what are we, our vulnerabilities. Again, I made some kind of physical work. These were soap hearts that you washed with, that you actually handled. Again, I became very concerned that I was only making video work and I wanted something physical out of it. But I really wanted to explore the physicality of it. And I started of the heart itself. As I said, it became very clean. And I started through watercolors to make other kinds of work, which were kind of more sensitive to the feel of it. And in the end, I was kind of making these watercolors. I wanted a way of joining them together. So I was making things in different sections and using laser cuts. This is a kind of, the redder one is a laser cut lying on a body. And how did I attach them? How would I join them together? And I decided, because like the heart is stitched into the body, that I would want to stitch them. But these were quite large. These are A1 sheets. How would I do that? I asked a friend whether I could borrow a sewing machine. She was very nice about it, but basically said no. She wasn't going to lend me a sewing machine, so I couldn't do it. It's a long arm sewing machine, so I could make the reaches into the work. She said, I want to do it. And when she said, I want to do it, this suddenly opened up a whole kind of set of work where I was asking other people to join things together for me. And when you began to think about it, it had all of the kind of same issues that raised for patients about the notion of me giving something away, what would be done with it, how would it be changed. And so at the Spencer Museum, this idea of setting up a project about giving people these objects, these things to join, happened. So these are the packages, the raw packages that I sent out in the end to 4 artists in the Kansas area that had been selected by the Spencer Museum. They did come from, in the main, a textile background, but this notion of joining something together. And as much as the actual finished pieces, we were interested in the processes and the anxieties that people had in undertaking this process. And these are the things that arose. There were, as I said, there were 4 participants, and they came up with some very delicate works about joining. And for many of them, they had to explore the topic from start and from scratch. They didn't know much about it. And we, as a team at the Spencer Museum, didn't give them much information about what was going on. And then what was very interesting was how they used the pieces and the sections that I gave them to make work. And they were very beautiful. I was very pleased with the kind of results of that. And those 2 projects, in a way, the legal questions of putting up an implant into the body or into the brain, and the process about giving other people some work to join together, kind of undertook what I've done for the Psyche show, in a way, and you'll know. So I was selected by the team in Bangalore who advised about the work, and I really then struggled to know kind of what to do in a way. But this kind of show at the Spencer Museum had been, recent, and that played on my mind as a quite good way. I knew that the gallery would, I felt that the gallery would like a kind of something that was participatory. And so I started off trying to kind of think, and it took a long time to come up with the piece of work that I sent out to be adulterated, to have changed. I did lots of drawings. I kind of worked on the computer back and forth, looking at old things that I had, looking at processes, thinking around the laser cutting, which I really liked as a process. And I thought that was kind of apt in a way, because I felt it was a bit like surgery or an action that happened on the brain, the cutting of it, the changing of it. And went through many kinds of drawings and devices, adding things. My difficulty was to, in a way, want ownership of the work myself, but also how to open up a space to others to operate in that wasn't too contaminated by me. So in a way, you can see that there was a bit of a self-portrait thing that started at one point. I dropped that because that became too much about me. I kind of played a lot with kind of devices or things that might be in the brain, kind of like the one that's like slightly tree-shaped here. Always kind of going back and forth, really. And these are some of the early attempts to get drawings right, and it took quite a long time. And in the end, I kind of ended up with this kind of more open idea about doing it. And this drawing was my final drawing for the piece, which, as those that have received the object know, it's printed on both sides of the paper. It was done with kind of printing and laser cutting. This is the pieces, me doing laser cutting tests here in the UK, and I had to do print tests, and I made a whole series of the works myself. And then obviously the work was actually all cut and printed in Bengaluru. I also tried, and one idea was to send out a book, going back to the concertina books, this kind of idea. But this is the final thing that kind of made it to being sent out. This sheet of quite a good quality watercolor paper, printed on both sides and laser cut. And so this, that's what I see as the front, but there was also a back which allowed people to play with it in any kind of way they wanted. And I've been really impressed by the processes that people have applied. And, though with one of the works that I altered, I have cut it, I'm quite interested that people cut them up or ignored the work in a sense completely in a way and went off on their own tangents. This is my working process to show what I did, just having them, I printed quite a lot. I mean, I'm sorry, I had an advantage in the whole project that I could print, and I had the facilities of the college to print more, to test more ideas. This is one of the first things I did, was print up lots of small test ideas. And it's why we made the PDF available to the participants in a way, so that you could do what you wanted with it and change it. But this is where I began. This is kind of a work table in process, just kind of messing and playing with it. I've probably like you, I found the process very difficult in a way. It was not easy to come up with an idea, and you as participants, those that are here, must have found it even more difficult, because in a way you probably only had one a two-sided piece to play with. You probably did lots of drawings before you committed in a way, but it's quite difficult. I had a little bit more time and a little bit more kind of materials in a way to kind of work with. And these are kind of some of the structures, the things that I thought were important. And I found it really difficult thinking about what I would change. And we'll come to those discussions. But in general, I was kind of feeling I didn't really want to change very much about my own brain. It doesn't function very well, and I'm losing a little bit of memory now and things like that. But the complexity of it, the whole picture, how it's put together with memory. But one of the things I was interested about this kind of relationship with nature, really, and regrowing and re-understanding the richness of the environment and how that impinges on our brains and our environment being very important, and how we should maintain it. So I did start to kind of grow a few things, very basic things. I kind of wish I hadn't just used cress seeds now. It seems a little bit like a school project, but kind of interesting. And I did that for one of the pieces. These are the other pieces that I made, kind of more with light and electrical things. But it really was the crest things and the growing things that became more important to me, and ended up in the Psyche show, and you'll have seen the interface and how that operates. And these are a couple of the things that I finally decided to photograph and to show, and the things that I liked. And I think, in a sense, that's where I'd like to end. I hope I'm kind of timing wise, I've done kind of reasonably okay, about 10 o'clock, and hand over to Marius to just introduce a few ideas and a few thoughts. Marius, from this place. I hope that I've summarized the kind of work. I had a slight problem with the PowerPoint. It kept jumping forward. I must have set it to play for a certain duration. I'm sorry about that, viewers. Right, Marius.
It was lovely, Andrew. Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to join you in this. And thank you for the invitation, and also to the team at Science Gallery, Bengaluru. I'm struck by a number of things in what you were saying. And the first of which is really this idea of the sort of the organic metaphor for the mind. I mean, the mind is an organic entity, and it does contain branching structures which resemble and exhibit many of the same principles as a tree and other branching forms in nature. Distribution, exchange, ordering, and flow are the kind of functions of, and communication, of course, are the functions of this branching form. The tree, which pervades is a recurrent form in nature. It's also interestingly fractal in that that increasing levels of detail get replicated, or the form gets replicated at increasing levels of magnification, if you like, different scales and so on. So there's kind of it exhibits self-similarity. Could you maybe tell me or tell us a little bit more about the importance of that sort of form for you as a kind of vehicle for art making, really, and something that shows this continuity and connectedness between the self and the environment and the surroundings?
Yes, I mean, it goes back a long way with me, in a sense, and I didn't realize that I've drawn dendritic forms for a very, very long time without realizing it. Only to be reminded at that show at GV Art by somebody about what the beginnings of it were, which was, in a sense, being told off for making a very complex drawing of a tree with all its dendritic forms, to sitting down and looking what a tree in winter was like, and that complexity of branching, and then only to find that my work wasn't put up in school because actually the expectation was that one was going to draw a kind of lollipop tree. And that was at about the age of 7. And I think ever since then, I've kind of had this fascination with trees in this form. And I think, when you look at it, I think you summed it up really well, in a sense, about this, it has the capacity to deliver this form. If you're trying to deliver something to a body, how else can you do it other than this dendritic form that splits and gets smaller and smaller and smaller to take material to the cells and also retrieve it? And so we have in the body, a number of circuits that are like that. Our blood being sent out, oxygenated, and taken back, deoxygenated. Our nervous system taking signals out, taking signals back. Our lymphatic system controlling our immune system in the same format, and it's extraordinarily pervasive and kind of exceptional. And I suspect that that pattern, as you've alluded to, also kind of fits our kind of real world situation in terms of communication. You know, the hubs of communication, the hubs of network of the internet, you know, single strong lines and big aerials, and then all this diversification into smaller and smaller scales, communicating, sending things back. So it does seem very vital. And as I said, the kind of work that I've done more recently on forests and trees and things like that, kind of understanding that, you know, I think it's really interesting when we think about trees also, that we really only think about them above the surface, and yet, you know, parallel and mirrored is this other the root system beneath, and then now we find that a lot of these roots are interconnected, and other plants are speaking to them, and they're speaking to other members of their own species. So if anybody doesn't know, I mean, the classic thing is acacia trees in Africa that are quite spread out. And scientists found that when a giraffe or an elephant starts eating the leaves, one tree, it begins to close up, but trees hundreds of meters away will begin to close their leaves so that they're less vulnerable to being eaten. And so there's a signaling system going on. And we know now that there's a much wider signaling system. So all this becomes really interesting. So I don't know whether I've gone off track or answered your question.
That's lovely. Thank you. So this idea of emergence and growth, which is actually a theme which crops up in many of the submitted works, which you can come to later as well, many of the contributed works. But this idea of the emergence and what's beneath the surface, and that, you know, because of the complexity of the form, you can almost sort of keep going deeper and deeper into that natural structure. I think comes across quite well, as well as the idea of hybridization as well. And I think that again is fascinating. I mean, I like the way that you think about the artwork as an analog for the body almost, you know, and it is something that you give, that you have and you give, and that others can work on and contribute to, and that we think of ourselves as a kind of amalgam of different influences and so on, whether they be physical or environmental and cultural. And did you think about ideas around, like, you know, the critique of the cyborg, or at least the celebration of the cyborg in some ways? I mean, you touched on some of the kind of sci-fi type ramifications of implants, for example. And as you no doubt know, there is a kind of body of theory around cyborgism, Donna Haraway's The Cyborg Manifesto, and so on, in which there is an attempt to recoup this idea of kind of technological enhancement and sort of turn it into something positive, almost utopian, particularly from a feminist angle, and to sort of say that, you know, we can embrace technology, as it were. This is a chance for transformation.
Yeah, I mean, it's an area that I'm kind of quite troubled by. I don't want to be a kind of Luddite over the whole situation, but you know, various things that I've kind of looked at have kind of suggested to me that we will run into many problems. I mean, you know, and it goes back to the Heart Project, really. And what you get there in the study that I was involved in, it's important that I should have said actually that the interviews that took place of the people that had received hearts and the donor families all happened outside the hospitals. So what you get is, you know, this major transformation, a kind of an extension of life, and people are massively appreciative of that when they come to hospitals and when they talk to medics. But actually, it seems like the people are, or a large proportion of them are in crisis about their own sense of self, because they've got something else inside them that they don't often know the history and where where it's come from, what it is, what it might be changing. And definitely in the conversations, though there are not many, there's not much evidence for it in a major kind of way. You do. What you are seeing is a kind of psychological changes, that people are kind of saying things about, well, they're saying they're not changed, and then they don't really kind of understand that they might change. I mean, the classic one for me is a man who's received a heart, and he in the video he's banging his heart, saying, "This is a really good heart. This is a heart of a young woman," and in a sense you can see that it's made him strong, but actually the team know that. this heart did not come from a young woman, it came from a slightly older man. And but there's a sense that psychologically it's changing his perception of who he is. So it's having deep kind of psychological changes in a way, which are kind of quite interesting. So in a sense, what I'm trying to say is that putting a device, putting anything into us is going to change us psychologically. And I think for a lot of those patients, it's really worrying about what's going on with themselves. I mean, it does seem to me that they have slight changes in taste and things like that. Nothing major, but there are small changes, but also psychologically, what does it do to them? And I think that they struggle. Certainly on the family side, the family of somebody who might have, unfortunately donated a heart are very concerned. And the concerns that they have and the psychological changes are, obviously they're suffering from loss, and it's very difficult to distinguish what's going on. But they're very concerned about, has the heart gone to a good person? They want it, to be a good person, and of course that's not always true. So that is not a kind of mechanical kind of sense of cyborg. But but the things that came up in the more mechanical thing over the Optogenetics project and the Can Do project are more about this legalistic thing, and about actually what the device does. The real difficult. I know that we've got some brain spinners like that are quite successful. But if you look at breast implants, if you look at vaginal meshes and all those things, there just seems to be a string of kind of biological legal complexities with it that make me feel, oh, this is difficult territory. Touching on it might help us a little bit, but we're a long way off about making these engagements. And I also more recently have been looking at space and space travel. And again, this is a kind of technology. But the problems, I mean, especially about the twin study of astronauts going up and the differences in physiology between people in space, whatever. And this, the realization that this complex network we have, the complex network in our brain, is really built from our environment. And that environment doesn't happen in space. And if we want to go to Mars and beyond and have children in space, that is going to be so difficult to replicate how we as a body are born and grown and live. So I'm skeptical about the cyborg thing. And again, another story, I had somebody I knew, a Danish artist, had a chip that monitored where he was implanted in his wrist. So people could track him through Facebook and whatever. I think it was within 2 weeks, he had to have it removed because of the kind of abuse that he got over the situation. So he didn't expect that. He thought it was a generous thing to offer this tracking, and then these things happen. So I'm kind of, there's some aspects of it that make me worry.
So we're talking about sort of ethical, at least ethical circumspection, control and discussion over these matters, rather than just sort of a headlong leap into kind of technological utopianism or hypermodernism, if you like.
Well, definitely, because if I just say, one of the things that the Heart Project was trying to get was, in primary, it was like, how do we feed the patients more information that they will understand some of the psychological difficulties they will have with this new situation? Because historically that hadn't been true. It was less like, so I think I said the surgeon just saying it's swapping a pump. It's not swapping a pump. It's just not as simple as that. It's not car mechanics. So
in terms of, thinking, I mean, say contrasting your work with Stellarks, who gave the opening lecture in this series. I mean, Stellark kind of puts himself, in the arena, as it were, and, engages in extreme performance to sort of test out, these possibilities to a considerable extent, and also to prompt our reflection on those. How do you think, it strikes me anyway, that your work is more, if you like, conservative with a small c. It's kind of using proxies or analogues of the human body and thinking about those and reflecting on it. It's a kind of contemplative approach based on forms and materials and so on, and reflection. Do you think that's a fair characterization?
I think that's a very fair characterization, and I'm a great admirer of Stellark's work. I mean, seriously. I mean, I think it's really interesting. But I think again, though, for me, it does kind of say what some of the issues are. I mean, I think it's summed up in his arm earpiece that, you know, his intention was that it would have a microphone in and whatever, you know, but through the course of it, he's had major infections in it, and he's never got to the point of it working fully in the way that he wanted to. And I think, you know, so you know, maybe as an artwork that sums up my place in the whole debate in a way that it's problematic. You know, and I'm not holding back. I think, you know, if the Can Do project would work fully and this device could be put into
Newcastle.
At Newcastle could be put in. That device could be put in, and the genetic engineering made effective. I mean, it would make a stunning difference to a number of people. And so I'm certainly not. I'm not conservative over that. I think we should push forward with that. I think there are great problems over equality, though, about who might get these things and who won't. You know, these are very. You know, it's like heart transplants. They're very expensive operations, and you know, I think in general, then, you know, they should go ahead, but it will be limited and difficult. But in terms of kind of looking at ourselves and our own brains, the things that we need to look more at are our relationship with the environment and a relationship to education.
Yes, I agree with
as being so vital.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, just to follow up on the point of the existing use of implants, I mean, cochlear implants are well established as a therapy for hearing loss and certainly, you know, long-term or congenital conditions, and similarly deep brain stimulation, where you put a small electrode into the brain, which can control symptoms of Parkinson's disease and severe depression as well. So I think those are relatively, but they are sort of, as it were, known quantities, and they're obviously tested very thoroughly and so on for those for clinical use, and there are strict controls on that.
Yes, but again, though, with the cochlear implants, I mean, I think there are issues within the deaf community about that, and in all of those communities, you know, there seems to be you know, the discussion. I mean, you know, I kind of thinking off the top of my head around dwarfism and elements like that. There's whole communities that think, well, we don't want to be changed like that, and I think that, you know, they have that right in a way. I think these contrasts are really important for us to acknowledge and to talk about what might happen in one group of people and one society, and what might be the consequences to another group. You know, and it's not just that over that; it's about land rights and countries, and, you know, comes back to the Ukraine and the terrible things that are happening there now. You know, you know, it's unfortunate.
Yes, I think that there's certainly issues of identity and political rights and so on, of, you know, collective identities around, you know, say the hearing impaired community and something. Do you want, you know, I think people to be effectively taken out of that community by this? Kind of,
but they reflect all of these bigger, wider perspectives, and some of that came into the work that was presented, wasn't it? Some of which we need to discuss, and just coming up with that idea, but thinking about, so what, in a way, what your project offers is a means of kind of, you know, changing my mind, or at least changing the proxy for my mind, which is the artwork, you know, or the representation of that. Yes,
and then
the proxy,
using and also, of course, tapping into discourse, into language and culture by means of, you know, verbal communication and visual communication. So this, in a way, we can change our mind because we have culture. We have the ability as humans to adapt our behaviors and change that and modify it through art, which is the manipulation of cultural signs and symbols.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think we don't give enough credence to that. I don't think in a society, I mean, just and the value that we give to objects that we make, because for many of these kind of topics and things, they're so deeply embedded in us that we have no other way of kind of externalizing them. So for me, artwork is a way of externalizing internal thoughts and ideas in a manner that we can't do in any other process or way, and so it becomes a way of thinking about the work, and art object is a way of thinking about where we are and what we're doing about it. And this process of, I hope, giving other people this opportunity to work in this area, was a substantial part of this. And I think it's kind of really important. And I think that you're saying, I think a lot of my work has been about kind of meditative places, a place to think about these issues that we don't normally get, to think in and again, bring back kind of other aspects of the world of other communities work and have been, and maybe Buddhism or other contemplative contemplations has always been important as a background to it. So and a kind of more holistic view.
Yes, and you mentioned that sort of connection with nature, and as it were, nature, not to sort of segment off nature, as it were, because we're all part of that. But that is definitely a theme that emerged in the contributed artworks as well, isn't it?
Yes.
Environmental concerns. I have to say, in looking through I'm enormously impressed and by the beauty of the writing and of the contributions as well. They're really marvelous, and it was a real insight. And I urge everyone to take a long and appropriately contemplative look at
the website. Yes, I know. I agree. I mean, there were times during the project when I started off with it, I kind of wondered what on earth I'd done. Setting myself this task, because I think that the gallery would have accepted a kind of maybe showing some of my older work or making some different work. And then I thought, I've got this engagement, and how do I honor it really, and how do I give something that suggests a space that other people can work in? And I think when I began, when things began to come back, I still worried about it. But as time has gone by, and now we have 25 participants, I've got happier and happier and happier, and I've kind of got really excited about what's happened. Sorry, my dog, or our dog, has just come in the background. If you hear footprints, he's just come in. I didn't know whether to leave the door closed, in which case he would scratch at the door at some wanting to come in, and that'd be as much of a disturbance as him kind of coming and saying hello. But again, that's an interesting thing. I mean, in a way, this. Sorry, I'm going to just kind of introduce him. So this is Bob. He's a cockapoo, very funny. But this is a kind of an interesting thing when we talk about our relationship to nature. I mean, immunologists, when they ask about your well-being in terms of immunology, will ask you about whether you're in love and whether you have a pet quite often. And both things can improve your immunology, the strength of your immunology. So it's kind of really interesting. So being involved with another person, and involved in a tight relationship with nature and a dog or an animal improves your immunology because of the bugs in a small way that you have in your environment that you're exposed to. Makes you better and more strong. So this is, again, I suppose, what I'm kind of pleading for at a kind of societal level, that we need to build on those things.
Yes, and also, of course, humans are social animals mostly, and they tend to sort of be adapted to at least small relatively small social groups between 12 and 20, I gather, according to some biological anthropologists, and that being sort of excluded socially is stressful. And that has a suppressive effect on the immune system, because then you kind of adapting a survival response, which is obviously trying to gather your resources and so on.
And I know, and I keep referring to the heart transplant project, and I know that's very particular, not in a way. In the Change My Mind, we were looking at kind of different kind of types of implants, but I think it does suggesting. I mean, one of the things that's very problematic about it is the anonymity in many countries or places about the contact with, where the heart goes. So that the people that have donated can't speak to the recipient very often, and the recipient can't speak to the donor family in many ways, and there's a massive amount of right. So the issue is one that you're saying is very much about a kind of psychological position and an exclusion, really, which is quite damaging. And part of the project was to try to review that situation really. And you can think about it, because certainly, looking at the problems of mechanical implants, and this thing about them kind of being interacted with the brain and taken over in a sense, suggests to me that any changes really need to kind of be biological in a way, and adaptations, and then the psychology of that needs to be. It probably won't involve other people, but it's kind of troubling that we don't apply ourselves more to kind of countering that really. So what you get in the situation of the heart transplant is people trying to write. So the recipient of a heart is trying to write so they are often allowed to write to the donor family, but it's done through an agency, so they never know who they are. But the people I've heard talk about it that have written hundreds of letters and never really been able to give their thanks or know how to do it. And vice versa. There's a real difficulty about this exchange. And I know some people that have had good correspondence as part of being a donor family, but it's never been enough. Because of course, a letter will never replace a lost child. So that all of these issues in that kind of aspect of implantation, it's very difficult. The mechanical one will be different, but then there's an odd thing, isn't it? Because at some point you've got a connection or relationship with the person that programs, or the team that program the device that go into your body. Yeah. And they're going to make certain kinds of decisions based on maybe their social position, status, and all sorts of things. So there's quite a lot of implications. And I suppose, and they're not factors that don't affect medicine normally, because obviously a doctor comes from a certain kind of way of thinking and applies a kind of medicine. It's a kind of this kind of notion of normality, I suppose, that will come up, because there's a lot of talk in the work and the drawings and the things that people have made about this requirement to return to normal. But then kind of like, what is normal? And that's part of the problem.
Who determines the norms? Yes, indeed. Yes. Yeah, and so questions of agency, I suppose, ownership, agency. I think that what's really strong about the artworks and the concept is that it does foreground that, and also questions of authorship as well. So the traditional thing around the author, who's the author of the artwork? Is it the viewer of the artwork, each of whom will have a different neural apparatus with which to assimilate that artwork, and therefore is reconstituting it when they understand it? Or otherwise, and similarly. So these kind of questions that emerged, around that Roland Barthes idea of the death of the author kind of thing. Those kind of questions are important, but they also have analogies in the ways that or parallels in the ways that we've been talking about in medical ethics and in these questions that you're raising, and more broadly in terms of democracy, control, agency, and so on.
And I think it's something as artists. I mean, I think the kind of the notion of teamwork as well has been one that's kind of not been in the art world particularly, but I think that the science art kind of arena has opened that up a great deal more, and it's a kind of an aspect I like, but one that artists have found troubling also, I think, because they're not in the position often financially to kind of engage in that way, in the way that they want to. And that's maybe something kind of moving forward that we need to look at, really, about giving the artist agency to build teams and to make work and to have these discussions. But certainly I'm very admiring of like Richard Wingate's team and people that he works with and the discussion that goes on. And, I certainly found it, working with the creator at the Spencer Gallery, really important. And then there's this relationship with other artists working on it, and then at the end coming together, because I think it was very important that we didn't have too much communication early on. I wanted them to make the work and take it on, and to have all of those issues. I think it's really interesting, because I mean, when the very first pieces that I tried to get stitched together came, there was a sense of like, from the person that was stitching them, like, well, Andrew, what can I do with them? If I cut these up, if I cut your artwork up, will you, be upset? And I think that's kind of interesting. So all those questions that reflected the heart transplant were coming through. And in the end, after a while, I thought, at first I thought, oh, I am a bit precious about this. And in the end, I just thought, no, I'm not precious about it. I can't be precious about it. Something more interesting will come out of this collaborative kind of way of working. And, you know, and that's what happened.
Nice. Can I just come to one point about that you raised earlier before we move on to invite some of the artwork contributors to contribute, which is really about the role of art and the therapeutic aspects of art. And so you mentioned, you know, the importance of the heart transplant project that you did with the Canadian team and so on. But so you were, you know, professional artists who were contributing to this question, but there is also the approach whereby, you know, non-artists or amateur artists, well, not even amateur, non-artists are kind of induced to produce artwork in order to address issues that are difficult to articulate verbally and otherwise. And indeed, one of the works nicely, I think it was the work of Srinivas Mangapudi in the contributed artworks, touched on the question of, you know, emergence and things that are out of the reach of words and rational cognition and so on. So I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts about the, you know, the particular role of art, that it kind of reaches the parts that other media don't, and how that, you know, if there's an element of that artwork can kind of deal with the ineffable.
I think it certainly does, and I think it's there, and I think we read a lot more in art works than we know, and that we understand, and I think it does sometimes go to like a gestalt of that idea or something, and it's internalized quite quickly as a kind of level of understanding. It was really important in the art. I mean, I can recount a bit of a story about the Heart Project, because it's run on and it's still there in the background, some sort of 10 years after starting. But in the 4 years at the beginning, about 3 or 4 years in the beginning of the project, the heart transplant team and the lead transplant person that we were working with, who's a fascinating person and woman, did not want anything to do with us really as artists, didn't really understand what went on. And then suddenly we had an exhibition of some pre and early works that she came to, but also she sent along some of her recipients of heart and who had hearts. And they were absolutely enthralled about the work. They also started to talk about elements of heart transplant that they'd never talked about before. And suddenly, after that exhibition, everything changed. And Heather Ross, who's a brilliant person, suddenly realized that the value of this interchange, that the art led to different stories, different conversations, and opened up different worlds, really. It became a massive point of discussion, in the same way that, you know, we're discussing the artworks now, and hopefully, you know, in a few minutes we'll widen it to a general public. I mean, there are fascinating stories and fascinating things that art does. I mean, otherwise, you know, I always, in a sense, kind of look back at I mean, you know, we think about the Renaissance, we think about the science, but the thing that we really know is about the art of that time. You know, the people and whose names we can recall. And it's not just because we come from an arts background, because I, you know, come from a science background as well. But it's interesting how powerful that art is from any period, what it reflects about an age and a time and the ways that people think. So I think that's really important. I mean, you know, and if I was talking about the work a little bit just before we open it up, one of the things I thought was really interesting about the 25 submissions, there was very little about a sense of enhancement or making things better. It was all about like a returning to normal, getting one's normal well-being back. Very, very little about like improving one's memory, improving processing power. If I'm right, I read them all 2 or 3 times, but I don't think there's very, very much. It wasn't a concern that people had, and very interesting, as you said, about how many of them were concerned with the environment. In my list, I kind of I mark them with green, the kind of statements that the names that are dealt and mention the environment, or the number of leaves or trees or networks that have been, and it was just like over 20% of people mention the environment, which I had no expectation of at all. I thought that the submission would very much be about enhancement and improvements.
Yeah. So yes, I agree. So there seemed to be a due skepticism towards the kind of tech bro Superman ethos kind of thing, So,
yes. I wonder whether it's time with the team to open up the discussion to everybody who's been very patient as we've talked on.
I noticed that there are quite a few of the artwork contributors present, at least from what I can tell by their usernames on the Zoom call. Should we just invite the contributors to put their hand up and say, how they would respond to the discussion so far?
So I think the contributors could just turn their video on and maybe unmute yourself, and maybe in the order that you'd like to speak, Marius or Andrew, you can call upon them.
Sure. Yeah.
And do you want to mediate that, Adashri?
No, it's all right. I mean,
it's okay. Okay, so people just right.
Well, I noticed, for example, just looking at the names of those present, Aditya, is that Aditya Putur, who made a work here? No, okay. It's a bit difficult to tell if who's okay. We've got some fakes. It's a bit difficult to tell who's who from just the name, the names, the usernames. Sometimes a bit different from their full name given as the artwork contributor. We got Francesca Snelling, and Himanshi as well, and I can see. And the team with Shyam, Uma, and Aishwari. Okay, why don't I ask, first of all, Himanshi Parmar to talk about her work. I could share the screen actually with that work here, if you can see that. It's rather lovely. So Himanshi, first of all, tell us about your ideas with the work, and also if there were any kind of issues that you would respond to in our conversation previously with Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
The entire conversation was so inspiring and very, I resonated a lot to a lot of the things that came up. And I think the work that came from me was very much in alignment with what y'all concluded with right now, which was the need to not really have to change, but the need to have to reduce and sort of go back to a more interconnected relationship with the self community and the environment, and not necessarily increase our individuality or separatedness, which is happening more and more so, and which also I feel happens a lot more because of technology. So I think there is a biased stance or an opinion to the work. And I mean, the storyline of the work was when I received the base artwork, I kind of was like immediately imagining it having so much space for things to be working through it. Like I felt like a lot of it made me feel like it is like I think Andrew brought up a lot of Buddhism for me for some reason. Like it made me feel this feeling of constant change and constant interconnectedness. And it happened to be so that the land that my balcony overlooks was being felled at a large level, like many trees were being cut.
Mm.
And it just all sort of tied in very well in terms of how we are getting more and more separate because of the technology rise and because of our wants and desires, which also leads to our attachment to our own thinking and our own sensations and emotions, and how that has actually resulted in these sort of catastrophes at such a small level, but also at larger levels across the world. And I think the outcome of the piece is very humble, and there's a lot of humility in what's there. But the idea was to take the plant work from the trees that were felled and kind of introduce them into this brain space, to be like, can we integrate the two of them and remind ourselves of what used to be one, which is now separate, essentially. I hope I did a good job of articulating it, but I think there are a lot.
I felt very sympathetic to your work, in the sense that about 5 or 6 years ago, from my studio window, my neighbor tore down a 100-foot tree, whose wildlife I'd always just loved. You know, it attracted certain birds that you just didn't get anywhere else. And so I was very sympathetic to the yellow JCB ripping things out, because they came with, I think it was 7 guys with 7 huge saws to chop this tree down, and it took them all day, and it just disappeared overnight. It's very.
And it really affects your sense of time. I felt like the further and further away we are from it, you're more in your brain of like past and future. And I feel like the closer and closer you kind of realign yourself with what you really are, which is natural, the more you can be. So it is more also psychological in its stance, I think.
Yes, there's something kind of strangely funny in a way, that our education, so that we can fit into a kind of commercial world, we're separated from many things in our education, and we need to kind of re-establish that. I mean, there's many things in the way we're brought up that makes us not question things, separates us things, in a sense.
The very fact that we go into a classroom, most of us anyway, for our lessons and so on. I was fortunate enough to have quite a lot of my lessons outdoors, because I went to this tiny little school when I was very young, and they made a real impression on me, actually. In the garden, literally. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nancy, that's absolutely wonderful. Is this in the Bengaluru area that you live, or
in Goa?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It looks to at least have been very verdant, doesn't it? And then it's being hacked about by this.
It was an absolutely massive banyan tree. It was beautiful, like a massive banyan tree, and there's a lot of interesting bird species specifically in this area that I'm assuming kind of lost their way because of this.
It's happening globally on a huge scale, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Thank you. Can I come next to Francesca? Hi, Francesca. And your work is here.
Hi.
Hi, Francesca.
Hello.
Tell us about you and your work.
I feel, first of all, I'm so grateful to be here. I feel slightly like a gatecrasher, because I realize that, I've been fascinated by the Science Gallery network for quite a few years now. I'm based in London. And I do realize that it was just such an honor to be included amongst the artists from India. So that was just my first sort of thank you, and also just how blown away I am by Andrew's presentation so far, and just to have had his work sent to me and this opportunity. I'm doing PhD research into the optical unconscious, the concept that Walter Benjamin wrote about, which first sort of took root from photographs that he studied, botanical pictures by the photographer. I happened to be reading Simone Weil. I don't know if everybody, she's slightly under celebrated writer of around the same period. who wrote about a book called The Power of Words. So, and whilst I'm doing all this, I have a writer's book, quite a significant writer's book, going on around the writing of my own thesis. So I just sort of did some free fall into just responding to actually having this sent to me by Andrew. I was very interested on another parallel. What was happening at the same time is that Ukraine was being invaded. And so I was sort of reeling from, as we all were, from the implications of that. Most specifically, the threat, not just of potential nuclear war, but the threat of a cyber attack. And the idea of the power of words then took on this really terrifying prospect to me of somebody like Vladimir Putin being able to actually control people's brains. So I'm rambling slightly here, but what happened as I was working this one out is that I also was looking at work of Susan Buck-Morss on Walter Benjamin and the connection she made between Vladimir Betz, who was the first Ukrainian, the first anatomist to actually, probably knows more about him than I do, to actually draw the cortex of the brain. And Susan Buck-Morss makes a very fascinating connection between that and Vincent van Gogh's drawing that he did at Saint-Remy, which I have in the middle of brain here in the background cut out, which completely mirrors these sort of dendritic forms that we've been talking about.
Yeah, the pyramidal cells.
Exactly. Yeah. So this connection that I love about Andrew's work, which I'm also obsessed with, you know, the similarities there, I just sort of threw that in and see what that would look like. I then had the Hermann Rorschaff Inkblot in the middle, which I've been working on a lot around these sort of because those inkblots were used by a lot of these theorists around who were looking at the sort of optical unconscious in between the wars. So again, we have this sort of idea of that interwar period and all this very fascinating research going on around this sort of specific time in history. So I wanted to look at the time in history that we were at, and the idea of obstruction and difficulty of language. And Simone Weil says, by the power of words, we always mean their power of illusion and error. So this concept of error was very interesting to me, especially as I was trying to write. And at that point, I started to cut up the book, which is not something I would have ever thought to do, but it just became an impulse. And I thought, what if I just scatter these words onto these incredible forms that Andrew has created and just see what would happen? And that's what I have done.
Thank you. That's absolutely wonderful. Yeah.
Yes. I really like the idea of the tree forms being kind of implanted into the head. I think that's something that you should continue with, because actually, reflecting on it, there are many artists that work with that, and I think it was one of the really early things that drew me to Joe Miro's work. His early pictures of the farm, where you get this almost hallucinated tree, and it's a reoccurring motif, really. In many works, and Mondrian too, where he did bare trees. Absolutely, and progressively abstracted them till he got the famous squares. So this was a drawing by Van Gogh when he was at the asylum in Saint-Remy. Okay, I didn't know that. Yeah, marvelous. Well, thank you. We need to move on, but it's really fascinating. And so we've got Deepika. Hi, you're a contributor as well.
Hi, yes, I am.
Yeah, and we've got your work, picture of it there. Can you see that?
We can, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I love the blueness of it and the wash and the way you talked about washing. Maybe you could say a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah.
And sorry, just a technical question, and people's ability to use so many different things in it was really interesting. So it's got video projection in it, has it?
Has, yeah. So I used watercolor, chlorinated water on it, and I projected a video clip that I kind of edited. I shot and edited digitally. Yeah. So my piece is, well, I started to think about, and I'm a mediator for this exhibit, so I got the chance to hear Andrew talk about his work previously, and immediately I kind of started thinking about how I would change it. And my work at the time dealt with a lot like color and the lack of color and how symbolic that what I'm currently going through as part of my mental and emotional state. But when I got, I completely changed my mind and started thinking about when I kind of feel the most at peace. And it's when I've started going swimming, and I really enjoy, you know, being in the water and kind of, because you're swimming, I think it's like parallel to being in nature. Like, you're there and you're just concentrating on breathing in and breathing out, and so that's what I wanted my to portray. And I kind of wanted to, you know, like, take that experience or the feeling that I have while swimming, and I capture like the same, you know, meditative motions to create this piece. So each of the strokes that you can kind of zoom in, see all of strokes are like, you know, like stroke, and like each stroke is, you know, is deliberately made, you know, like one at a time, kind of like it was a very rhythmic process to creating the artwork. And it's so interesting that you guys, you know, like creating artwork and like therapy, because this was a very cathartic process for me, because I was thinking so much about how I would change my mind and what I would change, and if I wanted to change at all, and it was a lot. And even like so I wanted to kind of show that, you know, like within those boundaries, about how like my thoughts and my mind is just like very chaotic, and like within water it's just kind of more streamlined and more like, you know, detangled. And for my piece I really wanted to kind of have a lot of my emotions and collage with it. And for my piece I kind of also kind of journaled, and it was again a very cathartic process, because I was constantly thinking of what would change and why I would change it, and if I had to change it at all. So yeah, and like the projections for me were like while I swim, I really enjoy looking at, you know, like the light and like the water and how they interact, and you kind of have like these constant motions, and I find it very therapeutic to watch. So I wanted to kind of I wanted to use that like visual somewhere. So I went and I shot footage of the pool while everyone stared at me like I was a lunatic. But I took footage of the pool, and then I projected it onto the piece. And like I have the, you know, like the iconic, the tiles of the pool kind of show, like you can see it at the bottom there, and like the blueness.
I wonder, have you ever swam in the sea?
I have. I actually visited Goa.
But I was thinking about if you ever have the chance to swim amongst kelp or seaweed, which is like a forest. It is one of the most extraordinary things to do, because you're cut off from the environment, and then you're in the extraordinary and beautiful world.
Yeah, I look forward to doing that. Hopefully, very soon.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Deepika. We have to hurry on, but wonderful, and it's probably it looks like an area that I think has a lot of potential as well. This idea of, you know, how we represent water and so on. There's a fascinating art history to it as well. Thank you. Next week, I think we have a team of Shyam, Uma, Aishwarya, and Lavanya, and you contributed. Just try and find the artwork. Go move a bit further up, I think. this is the artwork that you contributed. So yeah, hello.
Are we audible? Yeah, that's
yes, yep.
Yeah, that's the end. So thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. We aren't really artists. Our background is in science. Uma is a clinical psychologist, I'm a psychiatrist, is also a psychiatrist, and so is Dr. Sham. So we come to this from a slightly different perspective of having worked with individuals with very severe debilitating mental illness. We work, Uma and I particularly work, I mean, all of us work primarily with OCD, and Uma and I work primarily in a program that offers deep brain stimulation. So effectively brain implants to patients. OCD. So yeah, so that is the perspective from which we approached the piece that Khani gave us. So what we tried to represent was, we basically chose to fold the piece inwards, and we added more layers, because the first thing that came to our mind was an MRI. So you know about the various slices that show different layers, different levels in the brain. So that was what we got when we first looked at it. And then what we tried to represent was the various circuits, so the various tracts in the brain, the white matter tracts that are said to be kind of dysfunctional or malfunctioning in people with very severe treatment-resistant OCD, which is what we try to represent with the lights. And I mean, I know that it's not really visible in the pictures that we provided, but we tried to figure it so that the lights were kind of flashing at a different place to say that, you know, the person's whatever, the circuitry was malfunctioning before DBS, and then it kind of normalized a little bit or stabilized, and the person became a little more functional following placement of the electrodes and programming stimulation. So what we also did was, when we added in the additional layers, we also wanted to say that there was more to the story. So if you look at it from one angle, it basically showed how the person's life was significantly impacted by the illness. So the model is actually Dr. Aishwarya here. It's basically about how the life.
We've got a bit of interference. Oh yeah, okay, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah. So, so we talked about how this person was basically depressed also because of the illness, had to take a lot of different kinds of medication that weren't working, was basically non-functional and so on. And then gradually after, because DBS was offered, I mean, DBS is an invasive procedure and it is not for everybody, but then because it is considered only as a last resort when somebody does not respond to most other treatments. So, you know, and in cases when it does work, then, you know, there is a significant improvement in terms of functionality and symptoms. And then there is a chance that the person might actually be able to do a lot of things that they might not have been able to do otherwise. So that is what we try to kind of showcase in our piece.
Yeah.
So our goal was essentially that, you know, there is this opinion that brain implants, you know, could be unsafe, or they are a way of taking control of the mind. So what we tried actually showing was, you know, sometimes they're just there to help, or they're just here to facilitate a better living condition for you where it does actually work. So I think that's what we do. We tried showing that to give a perspective.
I mean, you say you're not professional artists, but I'd certainly encourage you to continue in that vein as a sideline, if nothing else.
Thank you.
I like the piece with the lights are very impressive. I like the lights. I like how everybody has done strange things, cut the piece up or put strings through, and all of that's very exciting. I mean, most of being an artist, I think, is just kind of going back almost like to childhood and playing. play is such an important part of life, really. But thank you.
Thank you very much. We've been kindly allowed another 15 minutes to continue exploring these. So we will attempt to keep to that. So just maybe 1 or 2 minutes from each of the remaining contributors. But thank you.
Marius, because I was just going to say, because you're on screen share, you'll have to continue to choose people because I can't see.
That's fine.
It's great.
I'll do it as best I can. And
thank you.
But that's good news, and it's hopefully a sign of health rather than our slackness at time management. But so thank you very much to the team from the OCD clinic, and so we've got Chaitanya who is here, and hi. I'm just very well and enjoying this conversation. I'm just finding your work. Is it? I'm trying to remember where it is. There we are. Lovely. Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah. Tell us.
So originally, when this came to me, I was looking at doing something digital, which is my usual thing right now, creating something in VR or AR or just Photoshop or something. But around the time that I was sitting on this, I was going through some counseling sessions in the preceding weeks, and I've been working on myself this last year during the Corona pandemic, and so I decided to revisit. I used to do paper craft in my college days, and a little after that when I was working, and somehow that all got left behind. So I just dug up the old tools and started ripping into it with a blade. And the idea was to have some kind of my thought was that the brain implant could be a tool of therapy, but it's also something that's modifying your brain physically. So to achieve that, so that's the kind of output I was looking at, these antenna or whatever they are coming out and making you more sensitive to certain things, or even just tweaking behaviors, being able to remove certain bad habits or toxic behaviors that are getting in the way of your life. So, I mean, that was about it. It was more of a therapeutic exercise for me to just sit and slash through it for a couple of hours. There was not more than that.
I liked it when your work came through, because I think it came through quite early in the submissions, and I suddenly thought, when I saw it, oh right, people have really taken it on board that they can cut it and do such different things. So did you study at art school?
Yes. Sorry, I didn't give you an introduction. I studied at Srishti. I studied communication design, and but there was so Srishti lets you do a lot of fine art courses as well. So I did oil painting, I did sculpture, a bunch of stuff before I specialized. And then I went on into, so my final project was a children's pop-up book, and with paper machines and things like that inside it.
I think what you did was really interesting and kind of a wider issue, because I've done a lot of digital work, but this kind of sense of returning to something that's much more simple and much more hands-on, it seems to me to be really important. And it was a very interesting thing you said, because in a way it's, the brain is not separate from the body. And it needs, and so much happens in through movement, and we need that. So we need to act as whole bodies in a way. So that kind of notion of almost like implanting something that enacts us all was really interesting. And I liked your bit about visualizing the ripping out of the bit that wasn't working properly. It seemed to work really well.
I was also looking at the concept of muscle memory. So there are memories in your brain, but there are also maybe memories in other parts of your body, which when you exercise them or you activate them, it takes you back to a happier time, maybe. Or it could work the other way also. But so just a way of activating a better mood or altering your mindset for that period of time while you're working on it. So thank you for this opportunity. It was a really good exercise for me. I've not had this much fun in a long time.
Yeah, we'll keep going. Thank you.
Lovely, yes. It has a really, and particularly this photograph has a really nice kind of sense of exuberance from the process, even though it's also, you know, involves some, if you like, destruction, but it is something exuberant comes out of it as well. And I thought that was rather nice, almost like the forms of dancing, the papers dancing out of it. Well, thank you, Chaitanya. That was great. So do we have any more contributors? Because not everyone's got their camera on, but is any more contributors? Vrati Kushwaha. Hello, are you there, Vrati? Who did the paintings?
Hello.
Hi.
Oh,
hi, this is Avriti. Is it okay if I keep my video
sure.
Like off?
Of course.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So, so thank you for this opportunity, first of all, to be a part of this exhibition. This artwork I came up with as I usually draw and paint. So this was like kind of like natural for me to see the artwork which Andrew sent us, and he was talking about mind, and then, you know, how we can change the mind to implant and to change it in a way that it can change our lives. So I couldn't think of anything else but anxiety, because I think with the current world pandemic and what is going on, most of us are suffering from it, including myself. So for me, art is in general is a way to soothe anxiety. And also I am a textile designer, so through this artwork, I usually depict emotions through my paintings. So in this, I'm trying to depict grief and anxious thoughts which comes into one's mind, and how, if possible, a cloak which could be made in the future, which gives us a feeling of warm hug, which can help us soothe this anxiety. So through this, I wanted to come up with something which can, you know, help with the anxiety. And yeah, and through the colors and through the whole composition of the colors, and you can see the cloak might look like something how our brain looks like. So all the small little like signs which are there on the brain and the veins which are there, so that I wanted to depict through my art.
Wonderful. Did you, with the choice of colors, could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. So I don't usually think what colors I use. It's a very in the flow process. I just take out all the colors onto my palette and just it's a very intuitive feeling which I get. I just keep thinking of that one particular thing. For example, I wanted to depict grief, like that kind of emotion through this. So that was in the back of my mind. And while painting, I automatically choose not so bright colors. Like, it was a very conscious feeling, because I am a textile designer by profession. So I deal with colors on a daily basis. So it came very naturally to me to choose subdued colors. And you can see on the left eye, you can see some blue color is like I have made that one rectangular different sections. So through that, I wanted to depict mainly the tears falling off, but they don't have to be simply blue, they can be colorful as well. So yeah, and also I don't paint humans of particular color, because like of no skin color, so they can be all have colorful skins and different shadows and composition. So yeah, and also yeah, that's how I came up with this.
Would you say that I mean, I've noticed that in recent years there's been more of an ethos, as it were, of empathy and care in the visual arts.
Yes.
Is that something that you feel, you sense? I mean, clearly you're contributing to that, as are all the contributors here. But
Yeah, I think, yeah, definitely. I feel that like very empathetic towards my art in general. Yeah.
I think it's a kind of strange thing, isn't it? Because technology helps us a great deal, but also I think in the current world, the technology of phones has caused a lot of anxiety. The kinds of images that we get of the aspirational aspect of the world now is very difficult for us to handle. I was out with my partner, my wife, yesterday, and I was saying to her, like in cameras often, when Kodak kind of develop algorithms that improve our pictures. So the outside world is like an improved picture than it really is, and we try to live up to that. So when we get snaps or photographs from people's holidays, they always look glorious and amazing, and we're trying to live up with that world. So the technology is a kind of difficult one, and yet it also serves to help us, as we've just heard with the science group and the helping with the stimulation. But we've got this other aspect to technology as well. It's such a two-sworded thing, and for many of us, technology has helped in communicating with groups and finding people that are sympathetic, which has been really important. So, I guess kind of coming back to making a point is that some of the technologies are like implants, but they work externally, and actually we're quite happy with those in many ways. They aid our brains. They make changes and improvements.
Well, thank you very much. And we have to start wrapping up now. But I think this has been a remarkable project. Congratulations to all who contributed. I'm not sure that I think we've been able to speak with all the contributors present in the call. But I think one of the contributors had to leave. But thank you to all of you for talking about your work in such sort of honest and open terms, and such compelling terms too. And the writing, as I say again, was quite remarkable. I think the way that you express what you have made. So my abiding thoughts from this are that the project, by this act of collaboration, by concentrating, by allowing multiple contributors, or by inviting them, by using materials, paper as a kind of proxy for the body in society, in culture, we've found some very interesting avenues, but also ones that if art can't directly change the world, at least communicates our concern for that change. And then, and so this idea of changing the mind, which is of course us, has rung very true and is quite resonant. So thank you, Andrew, and to Science Gallery Bengaluru as well for allowing this to happen.
Yeah, I would just like to say a big thank you to everybody. I think it's a very interesting thing, and I think culturally, I think it's kind of really interesting that there's a common sense about how things might want to be changed. I think it's really interesting about wholeness in the work, and kind of like opening it up in this way. It's like having a kind of science team working. It's like a distributed teamwork, which has been very nice to experience, and I kind of like that. Deities and gods and all sorts of things have come over in the writing. It's opened up culturally a kind of discourse. So thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you so much, Andrew and Marius, for this session. It was really fascinating. And I think thank you all the participants who made it and shared their thoughts. And, please do continue to share your thoughts about this work with us in the feedback form. The link is in the chat. So let us know how today's session was, as well as how your experience participating in this form of exhibit making for the exhibition was. So we hope that we would be able to conduct such collaborative programs going forward as well. So once again, thank you so much, Andrew and Marius, for this session. And to the participants, do see the rest of the exhibition before it closes, and share your thoughts with us on that as well. There is also an interesting lecture coming up in the next weekend by author Jerry Pinto, titled "Reading the Mind." So that might be interesting for those of you who were here today. So you could come in for that as well. So once again, thanks a lot, everyone. Take care, and we hope to see you soon for future programs. Thank you,
everybody. Thank you. Brilliant.